clean up your own garden before you turn to your neighbor and tell them to do something, which is kind of what you want to do when you're then tackling Scope 3. So you want to have some experience and some understanding of what it took you to reduce emissions before you start asking every single of your suppliers to take action too.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earthlings 2.0, the show where we imagine how we could be better versions of ourselves and build a collective future we actually want to live in. And the world we live in today is one where either governments are all in on slowing climate change, or they're in and then they're out and then they're back in again, or they're kind of like halfway in and just kind of doing the bare minimum so that nobody gives them a hard time. And, you know, some regions of the world, like Europe, are really steady on their commitments, going as far as to implement reporting standards that global corporations must adhere to if they want to do business in the continent. And so we started thinking, like, can't just depend on one thing to get you anywhere, right? Life is really about diversification. And when it comes to slowing climate change, the diversification that I'm starting to see here is yes, there's a role for governments, policy, and regulation, of course. There's also a role for markets. There's a role for corporations, especially ones that are operating globally. And of course, there's a role for individuals. And we do talk a lot about sort of the individual influence that one can have on the sustainability journey that this entire planet is taking. So that's why today we are going to explore how one global corporation is decarbonizing its own operations as well as encouraging others through its example. And it's this concept of these multinational corporations who have to deal with a wide variety of countries, policies, regulations. At some level, they're going to make a decision about what they think the future holds, looking 20, 30, 50, 100 years out. Some of these corporations have been around for 100 years already. And they're going to make some calculated decisions based on what they think the future holds. But before we get to our exploration of how a multinational corporation can influence decarbonization globally, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm the CEO of the award-winning technology public relations firm Technica Communications. Been doing that for 15 years. I am the founder of Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability, and I'm the vice chairwoman there, 13 years in that volunteer role. And before all of this, I was an environmental science reporter. I also covered tech and education and health sciences for NPR and PBS. I did that for 12 years. And I want to thank you for showing up today and listening to our podcast. I am thrilled that you're here, whether you're a new or returning listener. Thank you for joining us today. There's a lot of ways that you can support the show. And if you're a returning listener and you don't skip over this part with your podcast app, then you know all the things that you can do. And if you could just do one of those things today, I would really appreciate it. And those options are sharing the podcast with a friend of yours the next time you're talking podcasts or talking about these topics. Cite the show as a place where you learn some of this information. Also, join our Substack newsletter and get information about the show once a month. We won't spam you. Fill out our listener survey and help us understand information that you would like from this show. And if you're in a financial position to do so, please join our Patreon page. That is a great way to support us financially. And thank you to Resource Labs for having us on the network. Now, around the world, companies or corporations contribute nearly 70% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And the bulk of those emissions come from their supply chains. But here's the challenge. Decarbonization is not just about pledging carbon neutrality or setting a net zero goal and reducing your emissions. It's about navigating complex reporting frameworks like Europe's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, also known as CSRD. And that requires companies to report on their environmental and social impact. Or there's best practices based on scientific based targets initiatives, also known as SBTI. I'm telling you these terms because we're going to talk about them today on our show with our guest who is walking the talk of corporate sustainability and decarbonization. Her name is Vanessa Miler-Fels, and she is the Vice President of Climate and Environment for Schneider. That's a French multinational corporation which specializes in digital automation and energy management. Before Schneider, Vanessa worked in energy policy and sustainable innovation at Microsoft, and we caught up with her from her office in Washington, D.C. We kicked off our conversation around what sustainability goals Schneider Electric is aiming for.
So the latest environmental ambition the latest pledge we've made is related to net zero. Net zero is a concept that has really emerged with the Paris Agreement in 2015 and has then been embraced by corporation at the end of the 2010. And really we've seen companies setting net zero commitments early in the 2020s. We adopted our first our net zero targets in 2022. And we were one of the first companies that got these targets validated by the Science Based Target Initiative, which is a NGO that validates climate targets that are aligned to 1.5 degree scenario or 2 degree scenarios per the Paris Agreement of 2015. So our targets are aligned with these scenarios, and that means they're obviously robust scientifically, but also challenging for sure to achieve, because this is the reality of the world we're in, and we need to abate or halve emissions globally by more than 40% and nearly 50% by the end of this decade. That was set in 2020, and that's really hard. So our targets are to abate our emissions by 25% absolute between 2021 and 2030 across all of our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but I can explain very quickly. Scope 1 are the direct emission from our operations. So if you have industrial processes that uses liquid fuels, or emit any type of gas, for example, SF6 type of gas in your operations. The scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are coming from your electricity consumption, so indirect emissions from your electricity consumption, the source of electricity that powers your facilities, whether it's renewable energy or gas or coal. And the scope 3 emissions are most emissions for most companies, and for Schneider, they're 99.5% of our emissions. And they're the emissions from everything across our value chain. So from what we buy and what goes into our product, including the transportation, to the emissions that relates to our customers when using our products. So what's called the use of sold product, and the emissions at the end of life, from the end of life of the products we're selling to our customers.
Yeah, and scope 3 emissions are notoriously difficult to measure and reduce, specifically because it's not in your control. It's you're attempting to reduce these emissions that are being created through decisions of other people, right? At least 1 and 2, even if 2 is indirect, it's still somewhat within your control, and you can make certain decisions. So how is Schneider Electric tackling these scope 3 emissions?
Interestingly, most companies, their supply chain emissions are going to be the majority of their emissions. It can be up to 11 times their own operational emissions. And for Schneider Electric, our scope 3, as I've said, downstream and upstream, is more than 99%. But if we just zoom on the supply chain emission, it's only about 12%, 10, 12% of our overall emission. And so that's the emission coming from what we're procuring from our suppliers. And you can argue whether you're choosing the materials you're procuring, but there's definitely significant supplier engagement programs that we've set up over the years at Schneider on how to help our suppliers decarbonize themselves by providing solutions. Either helping them develop their own roadmap, but also even providing them solutions that Schneider can deploy at their facilities, like energy efficiency solutions, power purchases agreement, for example, so helping them buy renewable energy. And then there's what we can do to change suppliers if our suppliers can change themselves. And so here is a lot that has to do with design. How do we design our products? What type of materials are we using? And whether there are opportunities to change materials over the course of the design. I give a little bit more of illustration. The main sources of emissions coming from what we procure, what we buy, comes from steel, aluminum, plastics, and electronics. And so when we're making these choices of supplier selection, there's a variety of things you can do. It's, again, helping the given supplier to decarbonize or choose a source of material that is made with a different type of processes. For example, if I think about steel, you can procure what's called green steel or H2O steel, and that's really something we're working with some of our suppliers to see if they're growing their capacity in these types of lower carbon or lower environmental footprint steel. For plastic, sometimes it's more about, can we design with less? Can we design without? Or can we source recycled plastic? It's never one silver bullet. You just do this or get rid of that, but it's really that whole suite of solutions, of engaging with your suppliers, understanding the sources of emission within their own value chain, seeing whether we can help them address these, and if not, whether there are other design options that are available out there. So sometimes we've shifted from aluminum to silicon carbide. There's different, really a lot of material science that also needs to go in this. And maybe I add a bit of additional complexity. We think a lot about carbon, but obviously, and when we're talking about climate, that really is what the focus is on, is reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emission that gets spewed out. But we also need to think beyond additional environmental impact. And for a lot of electronic equipment, we have to think about the substances and the hazardous substances that are in the components we're purchasing, whether it is lead, whether it is cadmium, or whether it is PFAS. A lot of what we buy may have some hazardous chemical substances. And so it's not only a substitution from one component with X% carbon intensity to a component that is 0.8 carbon intensity, but also integrating these other factors to really kind of change your environmental impact of the products we put out there in the market.
Yeah, and I can see how some suppliers will probably be really receptive to that, but others might push back on it because it costs money to change how you're doing something, right? Sometimes you have a manufacturing process, you have machinery, you have other suppliers, like long-term contracts. So how receptive have some of your suppliers been to making these adjustments?
It's never black and white in terms of going sustainable. Some alternatives, some efforts will be costly. Some others will come at a cost benefit. And make us. There is. We have a very easy example on just sourcing recycled plastic that can be cheaper than virgin plastic. The question may be availability. So back to your point of whether they listen to you and like they're also supplying to others, like we're not the only one. I think this is where it's definitely when you're engaging in supply chain, it's an ecosystem change that needs to happen. And so the partnership we've always considered, I've oftentimes embraced other companies, peers, or even other industries. So if we've joined, for example, a few buying groups that are really sending a signal for a new technology or for a new material as a group, aggregating the demand so that indeed to the supplier, you don't have like 100 different types of demands with 100 different types of flavors, but all come like as an aggregation and send a much stronger signal.
Because Schneider Electric, massive international company. Like you work all over the globe, you make all kinds of products. So there's almost a power of the purse type of influence that you can have on the supply chains that I think is really important because we've seen those initiatives work really well at various government levels when regulations weren't enough of a nudge to get a certain type of industry moving or a certain type of process to help it scale up. And so governments have used their own budgets to encourage an industry along. I'm curious to know what are some of the biggest hurdles that you have experienced along the way that could be a good learning lesson for other corporations who are thinking about taking a step through your examples?
So many hurdles. I think we're still, jumping over those every day. But I think it's also sometimes understanding that you just need to get on this journey and not have the perfect be the enemy of the good. Understanding that you'll make mistake along the way and that you learn from these mistakes. I would say some recurring hurdles, maybe, that are like deeper things we need to address collectively is obviously data. Just having access to data to be better informed choices is extremely challenging. The regulation can help greatly on this, but it's still imperfect because the movement is not necessarily global in terms of requiring transparency of data on environmental impacts. And also because the methodology are not necessarily always standardized or the definition are not always clearly understood and well standardized. Well, when we're trying to lower the environmental impact of some things we're procuring, what data should you be using? Ideally, you would want to have access to the life cycle footprint or the product carbon footprint of the specific commodity or the specific component you're buying. That may or may not be available. And in addition, even if it is available, it is hard to evaluate the accuracy, the granularity, the robustness of the data that's being shared. But ultimately, as I said, the perfect can be the enemy of the good. You just have to advance with what you have. You may have imperfect data, but you still need to kind of continue working with that with what you have, which is better than having nothing. So I think this has been an ongoing journey of our own education, our own investment in data infrastructure, and obviously the same from our suppliers. And there would expect greater engagement from regulators and standard bodies in defining some of the data requirements and some of the definitions. Another example would be when we're buying recycled plastics, whether there are a clear definition of what is recycled content and how it's being produced, and it's not necessarily well regulated, depending the geographies you're in and where you're sourcing from. So you may have, only X% recycled content versus in another geography, Y% recycled content. You've, as for example, come up with some stricter definition, but we're still lacking this overall industry-wide kind of standardized definition.
It occurs to me that this is not an easy problem, and you have to be really dedicated as a corporation to want to adhere to your own goals. Like you said, you have these net zero goals, and we've seen over the past year or so sort of a retreat from some net zero goals? Like companies said that they would do something and now they're saying, yeah, we're not going to do it. It's too hard, or maybe they don't feel the pressure anymore. Who knows what goes on behind closed doors to make those decisions. So I'm curious, what is it about Schneider Electric that makes it so committed to these goals, even in the face of this difficulty?
I mean, obviously, leadership is a first ingredient. The conviction that leaders may have, and we've had a CEO, as I said, that started this journey 20 years ago, and was now the chairman of the company, Jean-Pascal Tricoire, and then our newly appointed CEO as of November, Olivier Blum, was previously Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. So I do think the vision of the leadership is critical to having kind of I mean, it's really to steering the ship and to making sure that it's because it's an all in on deck type of effort. I mean, to deliver on sustainability, it's never going to be just the CSO and the CSO team role. A 20, 30, 40, 50, no matter how big your sustainability team is going to be in a 150,000 company, is not going to be able to deliver unless it's really infused throughout the company as a vision and as a key goal we want to deliver. I believe also we're uniquely placed at Schneider because of what our business is about. We are enabling the sustainability of our customers and therefore have a critical role in showing how it can be done, which may not be the case for other companies that have set net zero goals that were more because, yes, they were inspired leaders, or also because that's what science is asking us to do. And so we may be listening to either the regulatory frameworks or the scientific bodies. You also need to find kind of the right approach for your business. And we have a unique position at Schneider to be able to demonstrate that. If we can create the blueprint for net zero, which requires a lot of the technologies we're supporting, we're enabling a lot of other companies to adopt these net zero blueprints and to deliver adopting technologies like the one that Schneider is providing. So there is obviously a beautiful, feedback loop or a virtuous circle that we can leverage in many occasions. Doesn't mean that everything can be done, because even if you're running a business that is selling sustainability, you're facing the same constraint as other businesses in terms of profitability or specific expectation on your balance sheet for this specific quarter. So we have to also really work hard on demonstrating that value within the existing financial frameworks. And maybe another ingredient that is key, I talked a lot about the leadership, but the rest of the people. The people at Schneider are truly amazing in that matter. I think most people join Schneider because of its purpose and because of its sustainability credential. And because of that, they're highly motivated and they want to steer Schneider in this continuous journey of sustainability, of improved sustainability.
You mentioned regulations, and I'm curious to know how some of the recent reporting requirements within Europe might help encourage your suppliers to go along this decarbonization net zero journey with you. We've talked in previous episodes about one that requires you to reduce the carbon emission content of items that are manufactured in Europe, or that come into Europe, I should say. How is that influencing the work you do and the work your suppliers are doing?
Yeah, and the regulatory framework is not universal. And so that's been one of the challenge. But obviously, some of the reporting requirements that have come up both in in a few geographies, not just in the US and Europe, but also Canada, Australia, even other countries like India. These reporting requirements have helped enhance the transparency and the understanding of everyone's kind of environmental impact. It's been challenging for a lot of our suppliers, and including for ourselves, I would say, even with the experience we've had under our belts over more than 10 years of intense reporting. CSRD required further work than we never anticipated. We'd been reporting on CDP for, I think it's the 12th year in a row where we're getting A rating. And so we've been really diligent on transparent reporting on environmental and social commitments and ambition. And yet CSRD and ISSB required a lot of additional work. And as I mentioned earlier, in data granularity and data quality, in governance, in detailing the transition plans, and particularly the financial investments that are required. There are stages in CSRD reporting, and we are already anticipating the additional disclosure for the future years, and the level also of control and auditability that will be required over the next few years. So I think there's been also a step approach that really allows companies to get on this board of extensive reporting. But more than reporting, I think what will be interesting and what I'm most excited about when we see the first CSRD reports out there from the companies that are already need to comply with, which is not all companies at this stage, is how do we read from the reports, and how do we draw lessons on performance and what can be improved? Because it's okay to publish numbers. We can likely all publish numbers at the end of the day, but it's what are we going to use these numbers to change or to do what? And I think this is really what will make the real world difference in the long run, is not the extensive reporting, but it's more how we've used the extensive reporting, and the fact that maybe for the first time ever, some companies are going to start reporting their recycled content or their recyclability content, or the volumes of hazardous substances that they have in their product, and then start realizing that they can take action to improve these numbers. I mean, it's we're many to say what you don't measure, you can't understand. And I think this is what these frameworks are steering us to do. There's always a question of, is there too much? CSRD is extremely extensive, more than 1,000 data points. So again, I think we'll see with the first reporting to what extent everyone is really able to play the game, and what lessons we can draw in terms of where we want to steer companies on a better sustainability journey.
When you're working with some of your suppliers, either on scope 2 emissions related to their own, how they use their own electricity, and then scope 3, what is some of the top advice you give them to help them start thinking differently about their own operations?
If I were to simplify, I'd say anyone was starting, and this is what we've done with our suppliers, you start with scope 1 and 2. You need to first understand your own perimeter, your own footprint, and clean up your own house. I mean, clean up your own garden before you turn to your neighbor and tell them to do something, which is kind of what you want to do when you're then tackling scope 3. So you want to have some experience and some understanding of what it took you to reduce emissions before you start asking every single of your suppliers to take action too. But electricity is where most of the carbon emissions are expected to happen in the economy by 2030. We can heavily decarbonize the electricity we're consuming. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, says we should triple the amount of renewable energy by 2030 if we're to stay on track with the climate scenarios I mentioned earlier, the 1.5 or the 2 degree scenario. So addressing the sources of electricity in your operation and within your supply chain is usually one of the best lever to deploy.
I appreciate that you shared the 1.5 or 2C scenario. because I kind of feel like we're a little bit past 1.5 in terms of what we're going to be able to hold this to. And I appreciate you being realistic about that. Maybe we'll come up with some miraculous solution that brings us all back down. But I think that's kind of where we're at right now, holding on to that.
There's a lot of talk about that. I mean, whether we should bury that 1.5 degree scenario and just admit that we're on track to 2 degrees. I mean, definitely last year for the first time in history. I mean, it was the hottest year in the record, but also we've passed this 1.5 degree. There is this question of the overshoot. That's always, possible. It's like, yes, we may overshoot for a few years and then you can bring it back down. Obviously, it requires a lot more investment to technology that are still nascent too. So I defer to the scientific community to confirm what is still possible to do. The latest reports that I've published still think it is possible to do it, to achieve it with significant, obviously, investments and effort. And I think we should do everything possible to keep that path alive because we're seeing, literally as we're speaking, the effects of climate change in every single degree or I mean, not even degree, like a 0.1 degree as an impact. As you know, right now there is an idea to pass what's called an omnibus regulation for the EU regulations to simplify kind of all of the EU regulation that has been adopted over the last 4 or 5 years, EU taxonomy, CSRD, CF3D. So there's a number of, and so there's an attempt to simplify. It's called an omnibus. And in that debate, there's position and groups that are calling for the 1.5 degree alignment, which is a requirement of the CSRD to demonstrate alignment or not, to be abandoned. So it will very much be, I think, it will still be part of the discussion in the coming years for sure.
What we know just from the interviews we've done on this podcast is that often the climate reporting is probably the most conservative because some climate scientists don't want to be too far outside of the quote unquote norm in terms of what other people are saying, even if the data is indicating that, or other analysts maybe don't want to be the only one way out there saying something different. Then you've got climate scientists saying, hey, we could do some overshoot, okay, but you have no guarantee that you're not going to initiate feedback loops that can't be reversed. We just don't know. No one has ever experienced this before on this planet. It's all new to everyone. And we have some really good data that indicates to us, even if it's on a conservative basis, things are not looking good, right?
Yep. And I think we should really listen to that science and the scientific bodies that are behind it. And when you're saying, yeah, there might be, single out scientific individuals, but like if we look at the IPCC reports, there is hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists that are working on in the back on these reports, and that come to a conclusion that is very clear. Should be very clear to understand, and a very clear signal to policymakers and economic actors. As an environmental professional, I want to start with that. Like, what's the scientific basis, and then determine, okay, what can we do within that reality.
I'm curious to know, are there certain regions of the world that might find decarbonization more difficult than others? Is it sort of a sliding scale when you look at your suppliers?
No, definitely not. Yeah, it's a wide range of situation, but I would say even within a geography, it's a wide range of situation based on the sector, on the maturity of the supplier. And it has changed quite a bit in terms of geographic impetus, in terms of climate change action. China is one of the fastest adopter of clean tech right now. And so it may be easier for some of our suppliers in China to decarbonize than in other geographies, just because of the general regulatory framework, the cost of these technologies in these markets, eased by some maybe subsidies, whereas in other geographies it might be like some competitiveness questions that are more acute. So it used to be maybe 10 years ago, oh yes, it will be easier to talk sustainability in these regions and harder in these other regions. I think that has changed quite dramatically. And yeah, we may see greater progress in geographies that were struggling, and lesser progress in geographies that seem to be plowing ahead. It's also, once you've picked up the lowest hanging fruit, well, the job is harder, obviously.
It reminds me of weight loss. I'm on a weight loss journey right now. And it's like, there's so many options for how to lose weight, and it's all personal
But it
because
has,
not
exactly, you have to make it work for yourself. And it's like, yeah, you first have to understand what you really want, what really motivates you, what are the incentives you have around you, who is helping you, who is not maybe helping you. Yeah. And so, yeah, well, whatever the journey is, sustainability, personal, fitness, whatever. Yeah, there are many options. The good news is most of the options for sustainability are known. And that's really what I'm interested in, is like making sure these that exist, like renewable energy, like alternative materials, recycled content, designing with less material, that these be heard, shared, and deployed at scale. Yes, there will be the last mile, which is still harder to scale, and there are technologies for the last mile that are still very nascent and will need kind of greater courage from the public and the private sector to really come off ground. But there's so much we can do in the next 5 years to just deploy the solutions that are already deployable.
Earthlings. This conversation reminds me of what my yoga teachers have constantly told me over the years. Your practice is about the journey, not the destination. You're trying to stretch into that pose, and your neighbor is much more limber than you are, but it's not about what they're able to do and you're not able to do. It's about the improvement that you and your body are able to achieve. That's the journey, and that's what you focus on when you're focused on your yoga practice. And the same could be said for corporate decarbonization. Every corporation is going to have a different type of body with different abilities and resources to make adjustments and changes to their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And it's not about how well they're doing compared to others. It's about how well they're doing compared to where they started on their decarbonization journey. And I really appreciate that Schneider is leading this with their own actions, right? Leading by example. And, some skeptics might say, well, it's in their business to lead by example because they're in the business of selling technologies to enable the energy transition and renewable energy. And I get that. I can see that perspective, but it takes a lot to step out of the norm, especially at an international, global scale, and say, this is what we stand for. We are motivated to lead, and we encourage others to follow us, not for our own benefit, but because it's going to benefit every living thing on this planet. There is no planet B. As you are well aware, Mars is not a solution. And so we all get a chance to do what we can here to make sure we are all on an individual decarbonization journey. And wherever you are in that journey and you're still moving forward, I say good for you. Because something that corporations struggle with is a fear of a backlash. If they aim for a goal and they're not on track to meet it in the time frame, or, they might be accused of doing too much on the other side of the scale. And sometimes companies are afraid of getting attacked for what they're trying to do. So then they're not as transparent about their decarbonization journey. And so then they start to sort of get quiet. And we call that green hushing, which makes it so important that corporations like Schneider are out there and being public with the work that they're doing. Speaking of leading where you have the influence, our faith in humanity is restored this week by Lori Lightfoot. She's the former mayor of Chicago, and she helped ensure that the city's 411 municipal buildings are now powered entirely by renewable energy. So from City Hall and the Harold Washington Library all the way to O'Hare Airport, every city-owned building is now either running on renewable energy or it offsets its emissions by supporting clean energy projects across the country. So back in 2022, Lightfoot signed this groundbreaking agreement with Constellation Energy to source power from the Doubleback Diamond Solar Farm. That is a 593 megawatt project in central Illinois, and it provides 70% of the city's municipal energy needs. That initiative was developed by Swift Current Energy, and it reduces Chicago's carbon emissions by 290,000 metric tons annually. That's about the same as removing 62,000 cars off the road. So thank you, Mayor Lightfoot, for helping Chicagoland along its renewable energy journey, using your influence where you can on this beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home.